The wind came before the snow. Annie felt it first against her neck. That sharp, cutting cold that slides beneath collars and finds every gap in worn fabric. She pulled her coat tighter, though it didn't help much. The coat had been her mother's once, a dark wool thing with a missing button and a fraying hem that dragged along the mud. It smelled like cedar and old grief. The road ahead was barely a road at all, more of a suggestion between the trees. She had been walking for 2 hours since the old cart driver had dropped her off at the edge of Dunmore territory, where the pines grew so thick they swallowed the sky. He hadn't charged her the full fare. She suspected he had seen the state of her coin purse, the pitiful weight of it when she counted out the last of what she had onto his cracked leather seat. 1 coin remained. 1. She could feel it pressing against her hip through the thin pocket of her dress. Annie was 23 years old. She had no pack, no mate, no home. That was the official story anyway. The story Greywood Pack had written for her the morning Alpha Derrick stood in the center of the gathering hall, in front of every wolf she had ever known, and said the words that couldn't be taken back. "I reject you, Annie Cole, as my fated mate. You are unworthy. You always were." She had stood very still. That was the thing no one ever talked about. How still you go when the bond breaks. Like something inside your chest turns to stone and then to dust, all in the space of a single breath. The pain had been extraordinary, physical even. She had pressed her hand flat against her sternum as though she could hold herself together from the outside. She hadn't cried. Not then. She had cried later, alone, in the dark of the small room she'd rented with the last of her savings in a border town 3 days' walk from Greywood. She had cried until her throat hurt, and then she had lain on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling and made herself a promise. You will not go back. You will not beg. You will find somewhere to stand. The cabin had been advertised on a notice board at the border post, handwritten in faded ink, corners curling from the damp. Old cabin, Dunmore Wood. Livable condition. 1 coin or trade. Livable condition had been generous. She had learned that when she finally found the thing, tucked against the base of a granite ridge, half swallowed by pine and winter bramble, its shutters hanging crooked, and one corner of the roof patched with what appeared to be bark. But the walls were stone. The chimney stood. The door, though it groaned, closed. She had paid the last coin to a man who hadn't even given his name. He'd handed her a key so old it had gone green and walked away without looking back. That had been yesterday. Now she was returning from the nearest settlement, a small trading post a full hour's walk south, where she had traded her mother's ring for a portion of dried meat, a small sack of oats, a bundle of candles, and a box of matches. The ring had been worth more. The trader had known it. She had known it. But she had no leverage and no time, and the cold didn't negotiate. The path through the pines was darker now. The light was draining out of the sky in the slow gray way of late autumn afternoons, when the sun doesn't so much set as simply give up. Annie shifted the bundle in her arms. The dried meat was at the bottom, the oats on top. She had wrapped everything in a cloth she'd found folded on the cabin's single shelf. Rough linen, stiff with age, but dry. She held the bundle close to her chest, partly for warmth. She smelled him before she saw him. That was the wolf in her, still working even now, even in the wreckage of what she was. Pine sap and iron and something older. Something that did not belong to these quiet woods. She stopped walking. The trees to her left were still. The wind had dropped suddenly, completely, in the way it only does when something large is present, and the forest knows it. Then he stepped out. He came from between 2 pines the width of cartwheels, and he did not move like a man who expected resistance. He was enormous, not in a rough, overfed way, but in the way of something built for a specific and serious purpose. Dark coat, heavy and well-made, open at the collar despite the cold. Black hair that needed cutting. a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the ridge behind her cabin. His eyes stopped her entirely. Gold. Not amber, not brown gold. Pure, burning gold. The color that only came with one thing. Alpha King. Annie's wolf went silent inside her, the way prey animals go silent. Not from submission. From pure animal recognition of something at the very top of the hierarchy. She made herself breathe. She made herself stand straight. He looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her. Dismissive, or worse, with that particular pity reserved for omegas traveling alone. He looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit where you've put it, like a calculation that refuses to resolve. "You're on Dunmore land," he said. His voice was low and even, and carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "I bought a cabin on Dunmore land," Annie said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "From a man at the border post. Yesterday." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, exactly. More like the addition of information to an equation he was already solving. "That land hasn't been sold," he said. "Not by anyone with authority to sell it." The cold pressed in around them. A single snowflake drifted down between the trees and landed on the bundle in her arms. Annie stared at him. "Then I have a problem," she said. "Because I gave my last coin for it." She didn't know what she expected. Dismissal, perhaps. The particular efficiency of powerful people removing inconvenient complications. An escort to the border. A gesture toward the road. He looked at her for a long moment, at the coat with the missing button, at the bundle of meager provisions she was holding like it was the most important thing in the world, because right now it was. Then he said something that made no sense at all. "Come." He turned and walked back the way he had come, between the two great pines, without looking to see if she followed. Annie stood in the gathering dark, one snowflake turning to two, the wind beginning again at her back, and she thought, "This is either the safest thing or the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to you." She followed him. The Dunmore estate revealed itself slowly through the trees, the way important things often do. First a lamp burning in an upper window, then the outline of a wall, then the full gray weight of the stone manor sitting at the center of a clearing large enough to hold the entire village she had grown up in. It was not a castle, but it was not nothing either. 3 stories of dark granite, ivy gone red with autumn climbing the east wall, smoke rising from 4 separate chimneys. The kind of building that had been standing so long it no longer felt like something that had been built. It felt like something that had grown. The man, the Alpha King, said nothing as they crossed the courtyard. A stable boy appeared from somewhere and disappeared again. A woman in a gray apron stepped out of a side door, saw them, and stopped very still in a way that told Annie everything she needed to know about who this man was and what his appearance on the grounds with the stranger meant. He pushed open the main door himself. Did not wait for it to be opened for him. Inside was warmth and firelight, and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. Something with rosemary and long-stewed meat that reached into Annie's stomach and grabbed. She had not eaten since morning, half a portion of yesterday's oats. She did not let herself react. She stood in the entrance hall on the stone floor with her bundle of provisions and her worn coat and her dignity, which was the only thing no one had managed to take yet. A man appeared from a corridor to the right, shorter than the Alpha King by half a head, with a scholar's build and a face full of pointed suspicion. Brown hair. Sharp dark eyes behind the kind of expression that had decided something before all the evidence was in. He looked at Annie, then at the Alpha King. "Chaos." His voice was carefully neutral. "What is this?" The Alpha King, Caius, set his coat on a wooden hook by the door, as though the question were not particularly interesting. "She bought the old ridge cabin," he said. "From whom?" "That's what I intend to find out." The sharp-eyed man looked at Annie again. His assessment was thorough and not unkind, precisely, but it was not warm. It was the look of someone trying to determine whether a new variable was a problem or merely an inconvenience. "I'm Edric," he said, steward of Dunmore. "Annie," she said. "Cole." Something crossed his face when she said it. Quick, almost invisible. She didn't know what it meant. Caius had moved to the fire. He stood before it with his back to both of them, hands clasped behind him, looking into the flames. "She'll stay tonight," he said. Edric opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "And tomorrow?" Caius turned from the fire then. He looked at Annie once more, that same steady, calculating look that she still couldn't read, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. "Tomorrow," he said at last, "we'll see what she's worth." Later, alone in the small room they gave her, warm, clean, with a real blanket and a candle on the table, Annie sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hand flat against her chest. The rejection scar was still there. It always would be. A hollow ache behind the sternum, permanent as a brand. But underneath it, something else. Something small and stubborn and strange. The Alpha King had looked at her like she was a problem worth solving. No one had looked at her like that in a very long time. She blew out the candle, pulled the blanket up, listened to the snow beginning against the window. She did not yet know what she had walked into. She did not yet know what lived in these woods, in this house, in the silence of a man who gave orders to fire and stone and expected them to obey. She only knew one thing with certainty. She was not going back. Morning came gray and cold, the kind that presses against windows like it wants to get back inside. Annie was already awake when the light appeared. She had slept, truly slept, deeply and without dreaming, for the first time in weeks, and that fact unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She should not sleep well in a stranger's house. She should not feel safe behind walls that didn't belong to her. And yet, she dressed quickly in the same clothes she had arrived in, the worn gray dress, her mother's coat, the boots she had repaired twice with strips of leather cut from an old belt. She folded the blanket with care, smoothed the bed, and set the unburned portion of the candle back exactly where she had found it. She would not take more than she was given. She had learned that lesson young. The corridor outside her door was quiet. Stone floors, 2 oil lamps burning low, a faded runner of dark green wool underfoot. She followed the smell of bread. The kitchen was at the back of the manor, past a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20, and a study whose door stood open just enough for her to see walls of books from floor to ceiling. The kitchen itself was large and warm, copper pots hanging from iron hooks, a fire already built high in the wide hearth. A woman stood at the work table with her back to the door, her gray-streaked hair braided down her back, her hands moving through dough with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this same thing for 30 years and found genuine satisfaction in it. She turned when Annie appeared in the doorway. Round face, deep-set eyes, brown and careful. An expression that was not quite a smile but was the preliminary condition for one. "You're up early," the woman said. "I can help," Annie said, "if there's work." The woman studied her for a moment. Not unkindly. The way you study a plant, to determine if it will survive a new soil. "I'm Marin," she said. "I run the kitchen, and most of what happens between the kitchen and everything else." She nodded at a low stool beside the work table. "Sit. I'll give you bread, and you can tell me what brought you to the edge of Dunmore Wood with 1 coin and a cloth bundle." Annie sat. She did not tell her everything, but she told her enough. The rejection, the road, the notice board, the cabin with the green key. She told it plainly, without decoration, the way you tell a story when you've already made your peace with it. Marin listened without interrupting. When Annie finished, the older woman set a thick slice of bread on the table beside her, along with a cup of something hot that smelled of black tea and dried blackcurrant. "The man who sold you that cabin," Marin said carefully. "Did he have a scar along his left jaw? Here?" She drew a line with one finger from ear to chin. Annie thought. "Yes." Marin's expression did something complicated. "His name is Brent. He ran supplies for the estate until 8 months ago, when Caius removed him for theft." She paused. "He had no authority over that land. Never did. He sold you something he had no right to sell." "Which means I have no claim," Annie said. "Which means Caius has a decision to make." Marin pushed the tea closer. "Drink. Cold tea doesn't help anything." Annie drank. The warmth spread down through her chest, and she was grateful in a way she couldn't quite express without embarrassing herself, so she said nothing. "What kind of man is he?" she asked instead. Marin was quiet for a moment, working the dough. "The kind," she said at last, "who has not had an easy time of being what he is, and who would be furious at me for saying so." She looked up. "Caius has been Alpha King of Dunmore for 11 years. He took it young, after his father." Something moved across her face. Old sorrow, worn smooth by time. "There are those inside these walls who serve him well, and there are those who watch for cracks." It was not an answer to the question Annie had asked. It was a more important answer. She was still sitting with that when she heard boots on stone. Caius entered the kitchen without announcement, the way people who have never needed to announce themselves move through spaces. He was dressed for the cold, a heavy dark vest over a linen shirt, riding boots, his black hair still slightly disordered from sleep. He looked, in the gray morning light, slightly more human than he had in the forest. Only slightly. He stopped when he saw Annie at the stool. "You're awake," he said. "You sound surprised," Annie said. Something moved in his gold eyes. Not quite amusement. The distant cousin of it. "I expected you to sleep later," he said. "Most people do, in warm beds they didn't expect." "I don't like to owe more than I can account for," Annie said. This time the thing in his eyes stayed longer before it left. Marin set a cup on the table at Caius's usual spot without being asked. He sat. He did not look at Annie with the dismissive absence of attention that powerful people use to erase inconvenient presences. He looked at the table between them, thinking. "The man who sold you the cabin," he said. "Brent. Your steward told you." "Edric told me last night. I confirmed it this morning." He wrapped one hand around the cup. "You were deceived, deliberately. That land has been estate land for 60 years. Annie said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "I should send you south," he said, "with a provision for the coin you lost." "But," she said. He looked up at her then, directly, the full weight of those gold eyes. "But the cabin needs a caretaker," he said. "It's on the northern edge of the territory where my patrol routes don't reach regularly. I've lost 2 sheep to something that's been crossing from the unclaimed land beyond the ridge. Something has been moving in that wood for months, and whatever it is, it's not a wolf, I know." Annie kept her face still. "You want someone there to watch." "I want someone there who knows what they're looking at," he said. "An Omega with working senses and nothing to lose is more useful in that position than a soldier who needs to be rotated back every 3 weeks. It was not, strictly speaking, flattering, but it was honest. She appreciated honest considerably more than flattering. "And in return," she said, "the cabin is yours, provisioned from the estate stores each week. You report what you see. You stay out of affairs that don't concern you." Edric appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was already dressed and already suspicious, his sharp eyes moving between them the way they had the night before. Quick, measuring, landing on Annie with that same flash of something she still couldn't name. "You can't be serious," he said to Caius. I usually am, Caius said. We don't know anything about her. She appears from the tree line with a false deed and a story that's convenient in precisely the right ways. He wasn't cruel about it. He said it the way a man says things he believes need to be said, regardless of the discomfort. An Omega traveling alone, rejected, with no pack ties. That's either someone who needs help, or someone who was placed. Placed by whom? Annie said. Edric looked at her. That's the question, isn't it? The fire in the hearth snapped. Outside, the snow that had begun in the night was still falling, visible through the small kitchen window. White and silent and indifferent. Annie set down her cup. She looked at Edric steadily. My name is Annie Cole. I was born in Greywood Pack, Eastern Ridge Territory. My mother was a seamstress. My father left before I knew his face. 3 weeks ago, my fated alpha stood in front of my entire pack and rejected me in public, loud enough that everyone could hear every word. She kept her voice level. I have no allies to be placed by. I have no plan. I have a coat with a missing button, and the knowledge that if I don't find somewhere to stand, I will freeze to death in a forest that doesn't know my name. She paused. If that's convenient for someone, I'd genuinely like to know who. Edric said nothing. Marin had gone very still at the work table. Caius was watching Annie with that expression she had already learned to recognize, the one that looked like arithmetic. The coat, he said quietly. What size button? It was such an unexpected thing to say that for a moment Annie simply stared at him. What? The missing button, he said. What size? She looked down at the coat, bewildered. Large, dark. It was horn, I think. He looked at Marin. Something passed between them, quick and private. Marin turned back to her dough, but she was smiling now, small, contained, aimed at the table. We have a button tin, Marin said. 3rd shelf, left side. Caius stood. He picked up his cup, finished the last of the tea, and set it down. The cabin is yours, he said to Annie. Provisioned weekly. Report what you see. He looked at Edric. She stays. He walked out. Edric remained in the doorway for a long moment. He looked at Annie. Not with hostility exactly. With something more complicated. Like a man who has learned to be careful and is genuinely unsure whether carefulness is the right response to what is standing in front of him. I don't trust easily, he said. Neither do I, Annie said. He nodded once, slowly. Then he too was gone. Annie sat in the warm kitchen with her tea and the smell of bread and the sound of snow against the window. She pressed her hand once, briefly, against her sternum. Old habit, checking the shape of the hollow the rejection had left. Still there. It would always be there. But there was something else now, too, underneath it. Something that felt, cautiously, like the first thin thread of a thing she hadn't had in a very long time. Purpose. She got up, found the button tin on the 3rd shelf, and got to work. The cabin was worse in daylight. Annie stood in the doorway the following morning and made herself look at it honestly, the way you look at a wound before you decide how to treat it. The floor was sound stone, which was something. The chimney drew cleanly, which was more. But the eastern wall had a gap where the mortar had crumbled away between 2 stones, wide enough to push 3 fingers through, and the single window had been covered with oilskin so old it had gone translucent and brown, letting in light the color of weak tea. The roof was the real concern. The bark patch in the corner was holding, barely, but there was a second area near the ridge beam where the timber had gone soft and dark with rot. She could see it from inside when she looked up. A shadow where there shouldn't be shadow. She had a week, she estimated, before the snow came heavy enough to matter. Maybe less. She rolled up her sleeves. The estate had sent provisions the morning after Caius's decision. A cart driven by a boy named Pip, who couldn't have been older than 15, freckled and gap-toothed and apparently incapable of traveling in silence. He had talked the entire way from the manor to the cabin ridge, which was 20 minutes through the pines, informing her at various points that Marin made the best venison stew in 3 territories, that Edric had once gone 3 days without sleeping during a border dispute and hadn't seemed to notice, and that the Alpha King had not brought anyone to the estate for any reason, in longer than Pip could remember. "Not since Lady Senna," Pip said, and then went quiet so abruptly that the silence was louder than the talking had been. Annie had not asked about Lady Senna. Not yet. The cart had carried a proper wool blanket, a second one, 2 good candles, and a full box of matches, a pot and a pan, oats and dried beans, and a portion of salt pork, a small hatchet, and, wrapped separately in brown paper, a length of good dark wool, clearly cut from bolt fabric, with a note in handwriting she didn't recognize that said simply, "For the coat." She had stood holding it for a long moment in the cold morning air. Then she had put it inside, on the shelf, and started working on the wall. By midday, she had remortared the eastern gap with a mixture of ash, clay, and pine resin she'd found described in faded pencil in the back pages of a small book left on the cabin shelf, a household manual of some kind, its cover long gone, its pages swollen with old damp. It had been someone's practical Bible once. She used it like one. The roof would need help she couldn't provide alone. She made a note of it in her head and moved on. By late afternoon, she had replaced the oilskin window covering with a piece of treated hide she cut from the edge of the extra blanket. Wasteful, perhaps, but warmer. And it kept the wind out. She had swept the floor, cleared the chimney pipe of a bird's nest that had been there long enough to fossilize, and laid a proper fire. When it caught, and the light filled the small space, and the smell of wood smoke replaced the smell of cold stone, something inside Annie's chest loosened very slightly. "This is mine," she thought. "For now, this is mine." She ate oats with salt and a strip of salt pork and watched the fire. Outside, the pines were turning black against the darkening sky. The wind was picking up from the north. She was nearly asleep when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. A feeling. The particular alertness that came when her wolf, diminished as it was, cracked as it was by the rejection, recognized something it didn't understand. She was at the window before she was fully awake. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty. Snow on the ground, blue-white in the moonlight, tree-line dark and still. But the smell, metal and rot and something underneath that. Something that wasn't animal and wasn't human and didn't have a clean name in any language she knew. It was wrong the way a note played flat is wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously, but wrong in a way that sets your teeth together. She stood at the window for a long time. Nothing moved. But in the morning, when she opened the door, there were tracks in the snow. Large, 4-clawed, like a wolf's, but the spacing was wrong. Too wide, the depth uneven, as though whatever made them moved with a lurch. She crouched over them and studied them for a long time in the gray morning light. Then she turned and walked toward the manor. She found Caius in the courtyard, alone, examining the shoe of a dark bay horse with the focused attention of a man who trusted his own hands more than other people's reports. He looked up when she came through the gate, and something in his expression shifted in that way she was beginning to recognize, the addition of her to whatever calculation was already running. "Tracks," she said. She described them, the smell, the spacing, the depth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Same as what took the sheep," he said. "What is it?" He set the horse's foot down, straightened. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he had a theory he didn't fully like. 3 months ago, he said, I received a message from the Eastern Territory. A pack called Iron Veil reported losing 2 wolves on a northern patrol. Not killed cleanly. Something had changed them. altered them. The bodies were wrong. Annie's skin tightened. Wrong how? Their scents were off, like their wolves had been, contaminated. He said the word carefully, like it was still provisional. I sent 2 of my own men to confirm it. 1 came back. He said the other had gone into the wood at the northern ridge and simply not returned. What's in the unclaimed land beyond my ridge? Annie asked. Caius looked at her steadily. That's what I don't know. And that's why I need someone there who can tell me what they see without panicking and without disappearing into it. I don't panic, Annie said. I know, he said, which was a strange thing to say about someone he had known for 3 days. She looked at him. The cold was sharp and bright around them, and the horse was stamping gently, and the smoke from the manor chimneys was going straight up in the still air. He looked, standing there in his yard with his hands slightly dirty from the horse's hoof, less like an alpha king and more like a man carrying something very heavy with nowhere to set it down. Edric thinks I'm a plant, she said. Edric thinks everyone is a plant until proven otherwise, Caius said. It's kept him alive. What do you think? He looked at her for a long moment. Those gold eyes, steady and precise, and carrying something beneath the steadiness that she was only beginning to see. I think, he said, that a woman who remortars her own walls in a day and walks an hour through cold to report unfamiliar tracks is not someone who was placed. He paused. I think you are exactly what you appear to be, and I think that is considerably more interesting than a plant. Annie didn't know what to do with that. She filed it somewhere she could examine later, when she was alone. I'll need timber for the roof, she said, before the heavy snow. I'll send it tomorrow, with someone to help set it. She nodded, turned to go. Annie. She stopped. Don't go into the wood north of the ridge, he said. Not alone, not at night, not for any reason. His voice was even, calm. But underneath the calm there was something that wasn't quite in order. It was closer to fear. The particular fear of someone who has already lost something to whatever lives in that direction and will not discuss the details of it. She thought of Pip's sudden silence. Not since Lady Senna. I won't, she said. She meant it when she said it. That night the sound came back. Not tracks this time. The sound itself. Low, rhythmic, like breathing but slower. Like something very large resting at the edge of the clearing, patient, and entirely without urgency. Annie lay on her bed with her eyes open, and her hand flat on her sternum, and she listened to it for what felt like a very long time. It did not come closer, but it did not leave until nearly dawn. When the light came gray through the treated hide window, she rose and dressed and discovered, on the flat stone outside her door, something that made her go completely still. A piece of dark fabric, torn, old, the color of dried blood, and on the inside of it, in faded thread, the letter S. She brought the fabric to Marin first, not to Caius, not to Edric. She had learned enough in 3 days to understand that some information needed to be tested before it was handed to the people with the most power over it. Marin was the kind of woman who had been watching this house long enough to know what certain things meant, and more importantly, how to carry the weight of knowing, without dropping it on the wrong surface. Marin was at the kitchen table sorting dried herbs when Annie came through the door. She looked up, saw Annie's face, and set the herbs down. Annie put the fabric on the table between them. Marin went very still. The fire in the hearth popped. Neither of them moved. Where did you find this? Marin said. It wasn't quite a question. Her voice had gone flat in the way voices go when they are working hard to stay level. Outside my door this morning, on the step. Marin's hand moved toward the fabric and then stopped, just short of touching it, as though contact would make it more real than it already was. The letter S, Annie said carefully. Pip mentioned a name. Lady Senna. Marin closed her eyes, opened them. She looked in that moment, considerably older than she had a moment before. Senna was Caius's mate, she said. His true mate. Fated. She paused on the word, with a weight that told Annie everything about how rare and serious a thing that was. She disappeared 14 months ago, crossed the northern ridge during a storm. No one knows why. No one saw her go. Her voice was careful and quiet and precise, the way voices are when the grief inside them has been compressed by a long time into something very dense. They searched for 3 weeks, found nothing. Not a trace. Not a scent. Annie looked at the fabric. Until now, she said. Marin pressed her lips together. You cannot bring this to him without knowing what it means. If it's a fragment of her clothing, it means she went into the unclaimed land. If it's old enough, it means... She stopped. It means she didn't come back, Annie said. It means something in that wood has been keeping pieces of her. Marin finally touched the fabric, one finger briefly, or leaving them to be found. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up, throwing dry snow against the window in small, sharp bursts. It's a message, Annie said. Yes. For him or for me? Marin looked at her. Her brown eyes were steady and sad, and carrying something that looked like a decision being made in real time. I don't know, she said. And I think that's precisely the problem. She told Caius that afternoon. She asked Marin to be present, which Marin agreed to without discussion, as though she had already expected it. They found him in the study, the room with the floor-to-ceiling books, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind him, in that posture she was beginning to recognize as his thinking posture, his version of going still when the world required stillness. He turned when they entered. His eyes went immediately to the fabric in Annie's hand. She set it on the desk. Told him where she had found it. Told him about the tracks, the sound, the smell. Told him all of it plainly and in order, the way she had told Edric her story in the kitchen, because the truth didn't benefit from decoration. Caius looked at the fabric for a long time. He did not touch it. The muscle in his jaw moved once. Then he said very quietly, How old is the tier? The edges have weathered, Annie said. But the thread is still whole. Months, not years. Something crossed his face then. Something that moved through so fast she almost missed it. Not grief, exactly. The particular agony of a hope that a person has been trying very hard to kill, because hope in an unresolvable situation is its own kind of damage. The hope that his mate might still be alive, and the equal terror of what alive might mean after 14 months in whatever lived beyond that ridge. Edric appeared in the doorway. He had clearly been nearby. Annie suspected he was often nearby in ways that weren't accidental. He looked at the fabric, then at Caius. The sharpness in his face softened by one precise degree, which was, she was learning, the equivalent of another man's open devastation. We go in, Edric said. Tomorrow, full patrol. No, Caius said. Caius. I lost Davin in that wood, Caius said. The name landed with weight. I will not send men into unclaimed land based on a torn piece of cloth that could have been placed there deliberately. He looked up from the desk then, and his eyes found Annie's with a directness that still surprised her every time. It was placed. This was meant to be found. The question is by whom and why, and we don't answer that by walking into whatever is waiting. The room was quiet. Then what? Edric said. Caius looked at the fabric once more. We wait. We watch. And we find out what has been moving past that ridge before we go looking for it in the dark. He picked up the fabric then, folded it once, held it for a moment in his closed hand, put it in the inside pocket of his coat. Nobody said anything about that. That night, Edric found Annie in the corridor outside her room. She had been given a room in the manor again. Caius had not suggested she return to the cabin after she'd shown him the tracks, and she had not argued. She was not, she decided, too proud to accept a solid roof and a locked door when something was leaving messages on her doorstep. Edric leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his scholar's face arranged into something that was attempting neutrality and not fully succeeding. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You were careful," Annie said. "I'd rather have careful than careless." "I said you might have been placed." He paused. "I still don't think that's impossible, but I no longer think it's likely." Annie leaned against the opposite wall. The corridor was lit by a single lamp between them, and in that light, Edric looked less sharp and more tired, the kind of tired that lives in a person. "Tell me about Brent," she said. "The man who sold me the cabin." Edric's expression shifted. "Why?" "Because he chose that cabin specifically, on the northern ridge. He could have sold me anything or nothing. He chose to sell someone the thing closest to that wood. That's not coincidence." Edric was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them flickered. "Brent was removed from the estate 8 months ago," he said. "Theft was the official reason. The real reason was that I found correspondence in his quarters addressed to a name I didn't recognize, a name that appeared twice in reports from the Eastern Territories about the wolves who were contaminated." He paused. The name was Voss. The name meant nothing to Annie, but the way Edric said it, quiet, controlled, the way you say the name of something you have been afraid of for a long time, told her it was not nothing. "Someone sent Brent to put a person at that ridge," she said. "Someone sent Brent to put the right person at that ridge," Edric said. "An Omega. Alone. Without pack protection or bond." He looked at her directly. "Someone who knew what moves in that wood, and understood what it does to solitary Omegas who cross into unclaimed land." The cold moved through the corridor like a presence. "They wanted me to go in," Annie said. "They wanted something vulnerable and unprotected near the boundary." His voice was careful and precise. "I don't think they expected you to knock on the manor door." Annie thought about the sound outside her cabin, the patient breathing at the edge of the dark, not hunting, waiting. "It's still waiting," she said. "Yes. And now I'm inside these walls." Edric looked at her. The sharpness in his eyes had not gone anywhere, but it had rearranged itself into something that was, she realized, very close to respect. "Yes," he said. "And now whatever Voss intended is considerably more complicated." He pushed off the wall. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow Caius will want to move the watch point. He'll want you there." He walked away down the corridor, stopped once without turning back. "Annie," he said, "the rejection scar. It weakens the wolf, but it doesn't remove it." A pause. "Your instincts are intact. Trust them." Then he was gone. Annie stood in the corridor for a long moment, one hand pressed to the hollow in her chest. The lamp between her and the empty wall burned low and steady. She thought about a woman named Senna who had crossed a ridge in a storm and never come back. She thought about something patient at the edge of a clearing. She thought about a man who had stood in front of his entire pack and erased her. And another man who had looked at her coat and asked about the button size. She thought about what it meant to be exactly what you appeared to be. Then she went to bed and lay in the dark and listened. The night was quiet. But in the deep hours before dawn, from somewhere very far away, from the direction of the northern ridge, came a sound that was not wind and not animal. It was a voice, low and ruined and barely recognizable as human, but unmistakably, underneath all the damage, a woman's voice, calling a name. Caius. Annie was at Caius's door before the sound had fully faded. She did not knock gently. She knocked the way people knock when seconds are the difference between one kind of outcome and another. 3 sharp strikes, and when the door opened, fast, like he had already been awake, already moving, she saw in his face that he had heard it too. He was already dressed, coat in hand. "I heard her," Annie said. Something moved through his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not hope, not quite. The terrible, involuntary crack in a wall that a person has spent 14 months building stone by stone and has just watched split from base to top in the span of 3 words. "Where?" he said. "Northridge, far side of the boundary." He moved past her into the corridor. She followed. They were both halfway to the stairs when Edric appeared from his own doorway. Boots on, lamp in hand, his sharp face stripped entirely of its habitual caution, leaving something much rawer underneath. "I heard it," he said. "We all heard it," Caius said. "Then you know we can't go in blind." Caius stopped walking. He stood in the corridor with his back to both of them, and Annie watched the set of his shoulders, the extraordinary tension of a man making himself hold still when every animal instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run toward that voice. "I know," he said, very quietly. "Voss wants you across that boundary," Edric said. "That's what this is. Everything. The tracks, the fabric, the sound. It's architecture. Someone built this to make you move." "I know," Caius said again. Annie looked at the dark window at the end of the corridor. Beyond the glass, beyond the courtyard and the pines and the long stretch of snow-covered ground, the northern ridge sat against the pre-dawn sky like a held breath. She thought about the voice, the damage in it, the way it had carried her name, his name, like something dredged up from very deep water. "It may actually be her," Annie said. Both men looked at her. "I'm not saying go in. I'm saying that whatever Voss is, whatever he's built in that wood, he had access to a woman who has been missing for 14 months. That means Senna is a prisoner, not a ghost, and prisoners can be reached." The corridor was very quiet. "Not through the boundary," Edric said. "Not directly." "No," Annie agreed. "But the unclaimed land has to have an edge. Boundaries always do. If something has been crossing into Dunmore territory from the north, there's a passage point, a gap in whatever Voss has established." She looked at Caius. "Let me find it." "No," Caius said immediately. "I'm an unmated Omega," Annie said. "No bond signature, no pack scent. If Voss has sentries at the boundary, they're looking for Dunmore wolves. They're not looking for me." "They placed you at that ridge deliberately," Edric said. "They know you're sent. They know what I am," she said. "They don't know what I'll do." She looked at Caius steadily. "I'm not asking to engage whatever is in that wood. I'm asking to walk the boundary line from the outside and find where the passage is. At dawn. In full sight of your patrol." Caius looked at her for a long moment. Those gold eyes, which she had learned to read slightly better than she had 3 days ago. The arithmetic running, the calculation processing, and underneath it, the thing she had seen the night she arrived. The thing she was only now finding a name for. He was afraid for her. Not of her. Not about her. For her. The way you are afraid for something that has become, without clear announcement or ceremony, important. "Half a mile from the boundary line," he said. "No closer." "Agreed." "Edric rides the ridge with you." Edric nodded once. "If anything crosses toward you, I'll run," Annie said. "I'm very good at running. I've had practice." It wasn't funny, but the corner of Caius's mouth moved anyway, brief and involuntary, like something escaping before it could be stopped. They found the passage at dawn. It was exactly what Annie had expected. A shallow depression in the land where the tree roots on both sides of the boundary had died, leaving a corridor of bare gray earth perhaps 4 feet wide, cutting through the underbrush in a line so straight it could not be natural. Something had cleared it. Something had maintained it. Whatever moved between Voss's territory and Dunmore had been using this route for months, carefully, deliberately, like a tradesman who keeps his tools in good order. Edric crouched over the ground, reading the traces in the frost. 2 sets of tracks, he said. One is the thing from the cabin clearing. The other is... He stopped. Human, Annie said. Human, barefoot. He looked up. Recent, last night or this morning. They looked at each other across the narrow passage. She's been coming to the boundary, Annie said. She's been trying to get out. Edric stood. His face was doing something it didn't usually do. The careful architecture of his expression had come fully undone. And what was underneath was the face of a man who had been carrying grief for a very long time, and was only now being given permission to set it down. He's been using her, Edric said. Voss. As bait and as a messenger. That's why she's still alive. Then we have something, Annie said. He needs her functional, which means we can reach her through the passage if we move fast enough. They rode back. What followed was not a battle exactly. It was something more precise and more dangerous. Caius took 4 of his wolves, his best, the ones who had been with him longest, and moved together like a single thought, and entered the unclaimed land through the passage at midday, when the light was highest, and whatever lived in that wood was least powerful. Annie had described everything she knew about the tracks, the timing, the smell. Edric had mapped the passage with the focused intensity of a man solving the most important problem of his life. Annie waited at the boundary line. She had argued to go in. Caius had refused in a way that was not negotiable, not with authority, but with something more personal and more absolute than authority. Not you, he had said. Not this one. And the way he had said it had settled the argument completely, and left her standing in the cold with her hand pressed against her sternum and an unfamiliar warmth somewhere beneath the old hollow. She waited. An hour passed. The pines were silent. The sky was white and heavy with coming snow. Then they came back through the passage. Caius first. A cut along his jaw, already clotting. His coat torn at the shoulder. Walking steadily. Behind him, 2 of his wolves supporting a figure between them who moved like someone relearning how legs worked. Unsteady, slow, wrapped in Caius's heavy outer coat. Dark hair matted and wild around a face that was thin in the way of long deprivation, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. Senna. Annie had not known what she expected to feel, watching them come through. Some complicated thing, perhaps. Some dark tangle of what her own losses had made her. Instead, she felt something very simple and very clean. The particular satisfaction of a wrong thing being corrected, of a woman being returned to the world that had lost her. Senna looked up as she passed Annie. Her eyes, dark, exhausted, carrying 14 months of things Annie could not imagine, focused on Annie's face. She did not speak, but she held Annie's gaze for a moment, with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but was the prior condition of it. Recognition. One woman who had been unmade by something beyond her control, looking at another. Annie nodded once. Senna looked away, kept walking. Edric, coming last through the passage, paused beside Annie. Voss, she said. Gone, Edric said. The wood was empty. He knew we were coming. He'd cleared everything. But what he'd built in there... He paused, his jaw tight. It's gone now. Caius destroyed it. Will he come back? Edric looked at her. Not to Dunmore land, he said. Not while Caius is standing. The snow came that evening. Heavy and steady and real, covering the tracks and the passage and the bare gray earth of the boundary line in white silence. Annie sat in the manor kitchen with Marin, who had made tea without being asked, and set a bowl of stew in front of Annie with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a woman who expressed love through practical action. They did not talk much. The fire was high, and the kitchen smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, and the old good smell of a house that had people in it again. Caius came in late. The cut on his jaw had been cleaned. He moved more slowly than usual, not wounded, exactly, but carrying the specific weight of a day that had cost something real. He sat across from Annie. Maren set a bowl in front of him without a word, and disappeared to the far end of the kitchen with the discretion of someone who had learned when to be absent. They sat in the firelight for a while without speaking. "She'll need time," Annie said. "Yes, but she's back." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. "You found the passage." "Edric found it with me." "You knew where to look." He looked up then. "You knew what to look for because you understand what it is to be at the edge of a boundary with no one on the other side." Annie looked at him across the table. The fire between them was warm and steady. "Is that why you kept me?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He considered it with the honesty she had come to expect from him, the refusal to give an easy answer when a true one existed. "In the beginning," he said, "I kept you because you were useful and because someone had wronged you on my land, and I do not leave those things unaddressed." He paused. "That is not why I would keep you now." The fire snapped. Outside, the snow fell on the roof of a stone manor, and on the ridge cabin where a proper fire burned in a repaired hearth, and new mortar held the eastern wall closed against the cold. It fell on the northern ridge and on the cleared passage, and on whatever remained of what Voss had built in that dark wood. It fell equally on everything, indifferent and clean, covering the old ground and making it new. Annie pressed her hand against her sternum. The hollow was still there. It would always be there. But it had been joined now by something else. Not replacement, not erasure, something that grew alongside the damage and did not require the damage to be gone first. Something that had started, she thought, with a missing button and a tin on a third shelf, and a man who had asked about the size. She did not remove her hand from her chest, but she let herself feel it. Epilogue. Spring came to Dunmore in the slow, deliberate way of northern places. Not all at once, but in small daily negotiations between the cold and the returning light. The cabin on the ridge was fully repaired by the time the first crocuses pushed through the snow at the manor's east wall. New timber on the roof, the window replaced with real glass. Small, slightly irregular, the kind made by the glassworker in the valley. And a second shelf added inside for the household manual and the things Annie had accumulated. A good knife, a bundle of dried herbs from Maren, a smooth river stone she had found near the passage that she kept, because it fit exactly in her palm. She still lived there. She had chosen to. The manor had offered a permanent room, and she had taken it for winter and returned to the cabin in spring, which seemed right to everyone involved in ways that didn't require much discussion. Senna recovered slowly and without drama, the way real recovery happens, in private, in increments, in the daily work of relearning that the world was livable. She was quiet and private and watchful in a way that reminded Annie of herself. And they had developed a friendship built mostly on the understanding that neither of them required the other to explain anything they did not wish to explain. Senna had taken a small room on the manor's second floor and spent most of her mornings in the study with its floor-to-ceiling books. And that was enough. It was sufficient. She was alive and she was here, and the rest would come in its own time, or it would not. And no one pushed. Edric had tracked Brent to a border town 2 territories east. The man had not resisted when Edric arrived. He had looked, Edric reported, like a person who had known this was coming and was almost relieved. He had given up everything he knew about Voss's network, names, locations, meeting points, with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for an exit. The information was useful. The network was disrupted. Voss himself remained somewhere beyond the known edges of the map, which was a problem for another season, but not, for now, an immediate one. Pip had somehow acquired a second gap in his teeth, and an expanded repertoire of information about everything happening in 3 territories, which he delivered on his weekly provision runs with undiminished enthusiasm. Marin still made the best venison stew in 3 territories. This remained non-negotiable. And Caius, on the first true warm morning of spring, when the air finally lost that last iron edge of winter and smelled instead of pine sap and cold water and something green and new, Annie was sitting on the flat stone outside her cabin door when she heard his boots on the path. She did not turn around. She had learned to recognize his particular weight on the ground the way you learn a voice, gradually and without deciding to. He sat on the stone beside her. They looked at the tree line together. The pines were putting out new growth, soft and bright at the tips, lighter than the old needles. "The passage is grown over," he said. "I know. I checked last week. It'll need to be watched. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to ask you something." "All right. And I want you to answer honestly, without considering what you think the correct answer is." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. In the spring light, his eyes were the color of old honey, warm and deep, and carrying everything he had always been too careful to say out loud. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because this is convenient or safe or better than what you left." He paused. "Do you want to be here, in this wood, in this territory?" A breath. "With me." Annie looked at him for a long time. She thought about a notice board in a border town, and a key that had gone green, and a coat with a missing button, and a tin on a 3rd shelf. She thought about tracks in the snow, and a passage through dead roots, and a woman coming back through it wrapped in borrowed wool. She thought about a hollow in her chest that would never fully close, and the thing that had grown beside it anyway, patient and unasked for, and entirely real. "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand. His was large and warm and slightly calloused, and he held hers the way you hold something you have been careful with from the beginning, because you understood its value before you fully understood why. They sat on the stone in the spring morning with the pines and the new light and the smell of everything beginning again. No ceremony, no grand declaration. Just 2 people who had each been broken in different ways, sitting side by side in the warmth, choosing to be here. The wood was quiet. The hollow in Annie's chest was quiet. Everything that needed to end had ended. Everything that needed to begin had already begun, somewhere between a missing button and a tin on a shelf, and a door knocked in the dark, in the way that real things begin, which is never dramatically, but always truly. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.